They called them the worst soldiers in the British Empire, and then sent them to do the job no one else could survive. You ever wonder what really happened when London's polished generals threw a rabble of Australians into Rommel's killing ground and expected them to die quietly? You've heard about El Alamein, you've heard about the Desert Fox, but you have not heard this version, not the parade ground myth, not the polished British memoir, the version the Germans wrote in their diaries at night with shaking hands. In this video, we're going to tear open the official story and ask a very simple, very uncomfortable question. If the Aussies were such a disgrace, why did both the British Command and the Afrika Korps end up terrified of what the 9th Division could do in the dark? We'll go inside the besieged hell of Tobruk, into the 12 nights of slaughter at El Alamein, and show you exactly why these men were called undisciplined scum in the officers' mess, and devils without rules in the German trenches. We are revealing the names, the numbers, the cold-blooded decisions that cost thousands of lives, and the brutal truth that never made it into those pretty post-war speeches. Stay with me right until the very end, because only in the final minutes will you discover the real shocking reason why British generals kept throwing Australians into meat grinders where any other division would have simply broken. They called the Australians the absolute worst scum of the British Empire, yet these very same ragged colonials were deliberately chosen for a mission of guaranteed tragedy. In the crisp autumn of 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery sat in his dimly lit headquarters staring at a massive strategic map of North Africa. He saw with absolute clarity that a frontal assault on the northern sector at El Alamein was going to be an unprecedented disaster of the first order. The brilliant German tactician Erwin Rommel had constructed a defensive wall of such ferocity that any rational commander would have trembled before sending his troops into that nightmare. The fortified gun emplacements and vast minefield belts stretched for kilometer after grueling kilometer, quietly waiting to claim countless lives. The elite German forces holding that terrifying line were not raw conscripts or easily frightened second-rate garrison troops. They were the absolute hardened veterans of the formidable Afrika Korps, surviving 2 brutal years of desert warfare and supplied by the finest logistics operation on the planet. Even the great Winston Churchill privately admired the tactical genius of the German commander who had turned the desert into an impenetrable fortress. A frontal assault against these perfectly entrenched positions promised nothing but absolute tragedy and unimaginable losses for the attacking forces. And yet, Montgomery coldly decided to strike precisely there, on that deadly northern coastal strip, where Rommel's defenses were incredibly strong and his reserves heavily concentrated. The only shocking question that remained in that silent command tent was exactly which unfortunate soldiers would be condemned to lead this doomed assault. Montgomery possessed a vast army of over 200,000 men, but his final choice sent scandalous shockwaves through the entire military establishment. He absolutely did not choose the immaculate Guards Brigade with their shiny brass buttons and century-old Royal Regimental traditions. He did not select the highly trained British infantry divisions who had been meticulously preparing for this exact monumental moment for endless months. He completely bypassed the brave South Africans and the steadfast New Zealanders, pointing his aristocratic finger directly at the men officially labeled as the disgrace of the empire. But this breathtaking act of supreme military hypocrisy was merely the first strike in a much larger, carefully hidden scandal. To truly understand why the British High Command trusted the most lethal assignment to men they publicly despised, we must expose the heavily censored events of 1940. When the magnificent 6th and 9th Australian Divisions first began pouring into the bustling streets of Cairo, the aristocratic British officers experienced genuine psychological trauma. These highly polished European commanders had been meticulously trained at the prestigious Sandhurst Academy, where strict military hierarchy was treated as a sacred moral religion. They sincerely believed that a crisp salute and a perfectly pressed uniform were the ultimate expressions of civilized order in a crumbling global society. The newly arriving Australians, however, had absolutely zero interest in playing along with this pompous and incredibly stiff aristocratic charade. They treated the sacred imperial regulations like cheap optional suggestions, casually wandering through the crowded Cairo bazaars, wearing aggressively unbuttoned shirts and bizarrely modified slouch hats. The stifling Egyptian heat routinely reached extremely dangerous temperatures in the summer, so the highly practical diggers simply chopped off their long sleeves and rolled up their heavy trousers. To the impeccably groomed European generals nervously watching from their shaded balconies, this rugged colonial army looked significantly more like a wandering gypsy camp than a highly functional military formation. The sheer audacity of their chaotic appearance was viewed as an unforgivable insult to the prestige of the British Crown in a highly volatile region. British generals were so absolutely furious that they immediately grabbed their expensive fountain pens and began flooding London with toxic official assessments. In highly classified government correspondence, these untamable colonials were brutally described as an undisciplined rabble who resembled a wild mob rather than a proper military unit. One senior British officer notoriously went on the official record stating that the Australians were the absolute worst soldiers in the garrison and a source of constant agonizing embarrassment. These incredibly insulting characteristics were not just angry whispers in a local tavern, but rather the official documented assessment of the imperial military establishment. They filed these derogatory reports away with the cold precision of a grim medical diagnosis, completely blind to the spectacular warrior spirit burning underneath those dusty shirts. Yet this outrageous bureaucratic outrage perfectly masked a much deeper conflict that was quietly tearing the Allied headquarters apart from the inside. The phenomenal behavior that truly shattered the fragile egos of the British officer class became notoriously known across the military camps as the selective salute. An ordinary Australian infantryman would casually assess an approaching high-ranking British officer with the cold, detached professional eye of a man evaluating livestock at a rural country show. If the aristocratic officer in question possessed a solid reputation for actual battlefield competence and genuinely looked after his suffering men, the digger might offer a rough, informal nod of genuine respect. But if the approaching commander was merely a soft, overly groomed staff bureaucrat with perfectly clean hands who had never faced actual enemy fire, the situation took a dramatically disrespectful turn. This brutal, devastatingly honest system of earned respect sent massive shockwaves of sheer panic through the luxurious British military headquarters. For the wealthy elite of London, this blatant disregard for inherited authority was an incomprehensible violation of the natural global order. The British simply could not fathom a world where respect had to be practically earned rather than automatically granted by a shiny piece of metal on a collar. Meanwhile, the hardened Australians found the dramatic British reaction equally absurd, completely refusing to bow before men who lacked basic survival skills. This was a fundamental philosophical clash between the polished ceremonial traditions of the Old World and the harsh, unforgiving practicality of the wild southern continent. The incredibly deep roots of this rebellious attitude stretched far back into 2 generations of a completely different social psychology forged in the unforgiving Outback. Australia had been built entirely by rugged individuals who survived purely on their practical abilities and their unbreakable loyalty to one another. A wealthy sheep farmer who could not diagnose a sick animal or repair a broken fence in a blinding dust storm simply lost his livelihood and faded into obscurity. A timber cutter who blindly deferred to incompetent authority rather than trusting his own sharp instincts in a dangerous forest usually faced an early and tragic end. When the brave sons of these resilient pioneers put on military uniforms and sailed to Egypt, they brought that exact same ruthless calculus straight into the chaotic war zone, but the arrogant generals in Cairo were completely oblivious to the fact that their worst nightmare was actually their only hope for ultimate victory. The incredibly polished British military machine completely failed to realize that the exact same stubborn independence causing absolute havoc in the Cairo streets was an incredibly vital asset. The sheer contempt for meaningless authority that produced the outrageous selective salute also created a soldier who would boldly question a suicidal order rather than blindly marching into a tragic disaster. The exact same improvisational genius that produced those wildly modified uniforms would soon allow these men to construct functional weapons out of discarded desert scrap metal. British inspectors obsessively measured the magnificent Australian spirit with entirely the wrong bureaucratic instruments, utterly blind to the raw, unparalleled resilience boiling right beneath the dusty surface. Oh, the breathtaking hypocrisy of the entire situation remains one of the most glaring and scandalous contradictions in all of modern military history. On perfectly crisp official paper, the British High Command had systematically labeled these rugged colonial volunteers as an absolute failure and a profound global embarrassment. They fully intended to keep the wild Australians far away from any glorious headline-grabbing victories, treating them like an unwanted burden in the grand strategic plan. Yet, the moment the Grand Maps suddenly demanded a brutal, uncompromising sacrifice to shatter the most terrifying defensive line in North Africa, all that bureaucratic disgust mysteriously vanished. The polished European generals suddenly realized that their immaculate parade ground soldiers were perhaps not the right men to hurl into an apocalyptic storm of flying shrapnel and exploding mines. When the absolute worst job on the entire front line required men who would simply refuse to stop moving forward, the British elite quietly tucked away their insulting reports. The arrogant staff officers suddenly forgot all about the unbuttoned shirts, the missing salutes, and the scandalous behavior in the dusty Egyptian markets. They desperately needed men who possessed the kind of extreme mental toughness that simply could not be taught in the comfortable classrooms of a Royal Military Academy. The incredibly harsh reality of the battlefield finally forced the pampered command structure to acknowledge the breathtaking value of the very men they had openly mocked. The grand illusion of parade ground supremacy was violently shattered, leaving the disgraced Australians to carry the heaviest and most terrifying burden of the entire desert campaign. The true test of their spectacular spirit did not happen in the bustling streets of Cairo, but in the blistering, unforgiving hellscape of a besieged Libyan port city called Tobruk. In the scorching spring of 1941, the 9th Australian Division found themselves completely surrounded and cut off from the rest of the civilized world. For 242 grueling days, they endured one of the most terrifying and sustained military ordeals in modern history. The mighty forces of Erwin Rommel pressed against their fragile perimeter from all sides, pounding them daily with a relentless storm of artillery fire and devastating aerial bombardments. The stifling desert heat was absolutely merciless. Fresh water was strictly rationed to a few foul-tasting drops, and peaceful sleep became an unimaginable luxury for the exhausted defenders. Every single logical military doctrine written in European academies aggressively argued for immediate surrender in such a hopeless, catastrophic situation. The German and Italian forces surrounding the dusty city were vastly superior in sheer numbers and possessed incredibly advanced heavy equipment. The Allied troops were supplied only by incredibly dangerous naval runs that frequently ended in fiery tragedies at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. The situation was so incredibly grim that the infamous German propaganda broadcaster Lord Haw Haw mockingly labeled the trapped Australians as rats caught in a trap. He fully expected these raw, undisciplined colonials to completely break down and wave the white flag of surrender within a matter of days. But the arrogant German strategists completely underestimated the brilliant, unorthodox mind of the Australian commander, Major General Leslie Morshead. This fiercely independent leader completely threw out the traditional European rulebook that demanded a passive, defensive stance during a brutal siege. Instead of quietly digging deep holes and waiting to be inevitably pulverized by Rommel's massive guns, Morshead made a phenomenally audacious decision that shocked the entire military world. He concluded that the only possible way to keep his trapped men psychologically intact was to ensure that the besieging enemy was significantly more terrified than the defenders. His magnificent response to the overwhelming German siege was not to desperately hold the line, but to violently and continuously attack. However, this shocking tactical reversal was just the beginning of a psychological nightmare that the German forces would never forget. Mooreshead completely unleashed his ragged soldiers, officially transforming their tedious defensive duties into something the elite Afrika Korps had never encountered in any previous theater of conflict. What emerged from the dusty perimeter of Tobruk after the scorching sun went down was not a standard military reconnaissance patrol. For 242 agonizing days, the brave Australians engaged in a completely different kind of warfare that their ancestors had perfected in the wild outback. They were not simply gathering intelligence for dusty staff maps. They were heading straight into enemy territory with the specific, chilling intention of making the Germans absolutely afraid to close their eyes. This was not a routine military operation, but a relentless, cold-blooded hunt orchestrated by men who knew exactly how to track prey in the darkest conditions. The terrifying details of these nocturnal raids quickly became the stuff of terrifying legends among the highly decorated German forces. The rugged diggers completely stripped away their heavy military boots, preferring to move silently across the jagged, stony desert ground in thick woolen socks or completely barefoot. They systematically blackened their faces and bare arms with dark boot polish or thick engine grease, transforming themselves into completely invisible shadows, blending perfectly with the desolate landscape. They left their noisy firearms behind, fully understanding that the chaotic close-quarters work they intended to do required a much more intimate approach. These incredibly bold raiders armed themselves almost exclusively with brutally sharpened bladed weapons and improvised explosives, ready to unleash absolute havoc without making a single sound. The psychological effect of these silent, completely unpredictable attacks on the elite Afrika Korps was utterly profound and extensively documented in captured records. Hardened German veterans who had victoriously marched across France and confidently conquered the Balkans suddenly found themselves experiencing genuine, paralyzing dread. These highly disciplined European soldiers who firmly considered themselves the absolute elite of the global military machine were now deeply terrified of the dark. Captured diaries and hastily scribbled letters sent back to Berlin explicitly described the Australian raiders as fighting in ways that violently violated every understood rule of civilized warfare. The German troops complained bitterly that these wild colonials attacked without any warning, offered absolutely no quarter, and completely ignored the formal military structures that European armies relied upon. One deeply traumatized German prisoner notoriously told his British interrogator that the savage Australians fought like wild, starving animals in the total darkness of the desert. The sheer, suffocating terror eventually reached such an incredible peak that standard military operations for the besieging forces began to completely break down. The Afrika Korps, famous for its iron discipline and unwavering courage, experienced an unprecedented crisis of morale right outside the dusty gates of Tobruk. Several captured German officers reluctantly admitted that their battle-hardened units had outright refused to conduct night patrol duties in the specific sectors opposite the Australian positions. The terrifying thought of stepping out into the pitch-black desert, knowing that barefoot hunters with blackened faces were waiting in the silence, was simply too much to bear. Mooreshead had successfully achieved the impossible, completely breaking the offensive spirit of a vastly superior enemy through sheer, unadulterated psychological dominance. But the breathtaking ingenuity of the Australian defenders went far beyond their terrifying midnight hunting expeditions. While the nightly raids completely shattered German morale, the daily survival inside the besieged perimeter required a level of raw, practical genius that baffled the British High Command. Operating in a state of near-total material deprivation, the diggers utilized the exact same survival skills their rugged fathers had used to conquer the harsh Australian wilderness. When the grand arsenals of the British Empire failed to provide them with adequate supplies, the resourceful soldiers simply began manufacturing their own devastating weapons from discarded garbage. The legendary Jamton bomb was not a sophisticated device found in any official military manual, but rather a brilliant improvisation born from absolute desperation. These crude but incredibly effective explosives were rapidly constructed using empty tin cans, stolen explosive powder, rusty nails, and raw determination. They completely lacked the elegant design of factory-made grenades, but they worked with brutal, terrifying consistency in the chaotic, blood-soaked trenches of Tobruk. The rugged men who meticulously crafted these makeshift bombs perfectly understood that a blunt, improvised instrument used with absolute ferocity always beats a sophisticated weapon sitting uselessly in a faraway warehouse. This phenomenal philosophy of practical adaptation spread rapidly through every single aspect of the grueling 242-day defense. When vital military vehicles inevitably broke down in the choking sandstorms and replacement parts were impossible to acquire, resourceful Australian mechanics aggressively cannibalized multiple destroyed wrecks just to keep a single precious engine running. They possessed an incredible ability to look at a pile of completely useless scrap metal and see a functional solution to a critical, life-threatening problem. When the precious water supply reached dangerously low levels, they rapidly improvised complex collection systems using whatever discarded materials they could scavenge from the ruined city. They brilliantly jury-rigged failing radio equipment and continuously found highly creative ways to maintain essential communications when traditional military technology completely failed them. These remarkable men were not highly educated engineers or carefully selected technical specialists from prestigious universities. They were simply ordinary Australians who had grown up in a fiercely demanding environment that required absolute adaptability as a basic baseline condition for simple existence. But the ultimate test of their undeniable value was rapidly approaching, an apocalyptic clash that would finally expose the staggering hypocrisy of the entire Imperial command. In the crisp, tension-filled autumn of 1942, the sweeping desert plains of North Africa became the stage for the most massive and complex military operation the British Empire had ever mounted. General Montgomery had meticulously assembled an absolutely colossal fighting force, gathering approximately 220,000 men, over 1,000 heavy tanks, and nearly 2,000 massive artillery pieces. This unprecedented concentration of sheer military power completely dwarfed anything previously available to Allied commanders, seemingly guaranteeing an easy, overwhelming victory against Rommel's forces. The brilliant German tactician could only muster around 115,000 exhausted men and a meager 540 tanks, many of which were unreliable Italian vehicles prone to catastrophic failure. On paper, the numerical advantage decisively favored the confident British commanders, but Rommel's terrifying defensive position was constructed with such expert sophistication that raw numbers simply were not enough. Montgomery hatched a brilliant, massive deception plan to convince the German leadership that the main British assault would strike the softer southern sector of the sprawling defensive line. The clever trick worked perfectly to a certain degree, but the harsh reality was that the northern assault still had to violently break through genuine, heavily fortified German defenses. Those impenetrable northern coastal positions were held by the absolute cream of the Afrika Korps, hardened veterans of the 90th Light Division and the 21st Panzer Division, who were rarely fooled by simple tricks. To keep these elite German formations permanently pinned down while the main British armored thrust successfully developed elsewhere, someone had to launch a suicidal frontal assault directly into the enemy's strongest teeth. Someone had to hit the entrenched German lines hard enough and continuously enough to completely convince Rommel that the real breakthrough attempt was happening exactly where they stood. Someone had to be incredibly willing to absorb the catastrophic casualties that inevitably come with sustained frontal assaults against heavily prepared, deeply mined defensive positions. And when the polished British generals looked around for an expendable asset to throw into this terrifying meat grinder, their eyes inevitably landed on the exact men they had officially labeled as a disgrace. Oh, the brutal assignment was coldly handed to the 9th Australian Division, sparking one of the most savage and least celebrated actions in the entire bloody history of modern warfare. The tragic fighting violently erupted on the dark night of the 23rd of October and did not meaningfully stop for 12 agonizing blood-soaked days. The incredibly resilient Australian soldiers were ordered to drive directly northward toward the Mediterranean coast, desperately attempting to sever the vital coastal road and critical rail line behind the entrenched German positions. This was absolutely not a tactical maneuver designed with the survival or basic welfare of the division in mind. It was a cold, calculated strategy designed to solve a massive problem for the British command. The men of the 9th Division were officially treated as an expendable asset to be completely consumed in the grand achievement of a larger operational objective. The desolate terrain in that hellish northern sector provided absolutely zero natural cover, consisting only of flat, terribly exposed, stony ground that was absolutely perfect for lethal German anti-tank guns. The highly experienced enemy forces had spent endless weeks carefully preparing interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any advancing unit would instantly face a devastating crossfire from multiple unseen directions. The dense mine belts in this specific sector were particularly terrifying, and the brave diggers moving forward in the suffocating darkness never truly knew if the sandy ground beneath their tired feet was safe or heavily wired with explosives. Despite the overwhelming, paralyzing danger and the terrifying lack of decent cover, the stubborn Australians simply refused to stop moving forward. Night after night, for 12 consecutive, unimaginably brutal nights, the 9th Division aggressively attacked the fortified German positions without a single moment of hesitation. They fought at incredibly close quarters in horrific conditions that violently reduced civilized warfare to its most elemental, terrifying form, desperately battling for meaningless pieces of empty desert ground. The sheer number of casualties was absolutely appalling, describing a scale of collective suffering that truly defies basic human comprehension and simple logic. In just 12 days of continuous hellish fighting, the 9th Australian Division suffered nearly 6,000 devastating casualties, leaving thousands of young, brave men severely wounded, tragically captured, or completely lost to the desert sands forever. For a division originally consisting of approximately 15,000 men, that horrific number represented a catastrophic casualty rate of close to 40% in less than a single fortnight of combat. Yet, through all of the overwhelming tragedy and the suffocating despair, the magnificent division absolutely did not stop their relentless, crushing attacks. The devastating effect on German operational planning was exactly what the cold, calculating Montgomery had desperately required to achieve his grand strategic victory. Rommel, frantically watching the unbelievable ferocity of the Australian assault in the north, fully concluded that this was indeed the main British effort and aggressively committed his precious armored reserves accordingly. The elite 15th Panzer Division was thrown into a series of desperate counterattacks against the unyielding Australians, bleeding the Afrika Korps of vital tanks and experienced men it simply could never replace. By the time the brilliant German commander finally realized that the actual British breakthrough was tearing through a completely different sector, his crucial reserve forces had been entirely consumed. The massive, impenetrable door that the stubborn Australians had violently knocked down with their own fragile bodies was exactly the door through which the pristine British armor poured to complete the ultimate victory. The men who composed those terrifying casualty figures were not professional, career-driven soldiers who had willingly accepted such extreme risks as the basic terms of their employment. They were simple volunteers who had left quiet farms, small shops, and dusty offices to fight in a desolate landscape that had absolutely nothing to do with their peaceful homes in Queensland or Victoria. They marched directly into that apocalyptic storm of flying shrapnel, not because they were foolishly indifferent to their own survival, but because of a deeply ingrained cultural ethos that demanded absolute loyalty. They simply did not stop when the agonizing going became difficult, and they definitely did not stop when the brave man standing right next to them tragically fell to the unforgiving ground. They kept moving violently forward because stopping was absolutely unacceptable to the fiercely loyal men around them, and the honest opinion of their trusted brothers was the only thing that truly mattered. They marched into absolute devastation simply because the guy next to them was marching, proving that true, unbreakable discipline is forged in blood, not on a polished parade ground. But the most incredible vindication of their unimaginable sacrifice did not come from the grateful lips of the British commanders, but from the terrified whispers of the enemy. When the blinding smoke finally cleared over the ravaged desert of El Alamein, the captured German officers questioned after the battle spoke about the Australian attacks with a consistency that amounted to professional awe. The men of the 90th Light Division, widely considered the absolute elite of the formidable Afrika Korps, openly admitted that they had never witnessed such raw, terrifying ferocity. One deeply shaken German commander reportedly stated that his unit had faced the brutal Soviet infantry on the Eastern Front and the highly trained British forces in earlier campaigns, but absolutely nothing had prepared them for the 9th Division. And they watched in sheer disbelief as the Australians came forward, regardless of horrific casualties, continuously attacking after suffering losses that would have completely shattered any other military formation on the planet. This phenomenal statement, coming from the most experienced veterans of the German war machine, was the ultimate validation of everything the ragged colonials had demonstrated since the earliest days of Tobruk. Even General Montgomery, a man not historically known for handing out extravagant compliments, was finally forced to update his arrogant assumptions by undeniable events he simply could not ignore. In his widely read post-war memoirs, he coldly acknowledged that without the relentless Australian attack in the bloody northern sector, the monumental victory at El Alamein could not have been achieved. Stripped of all the formal, polite military language, the highest-ranking British commander quietly admitted that the exact same division his officers had called a disgrace had just saved the entire North African campaign. Yet, despite this phenomenal world-changing triumph, the deeply entrenched institutional hypocrisy of the British Empire managed to strike one final infuriating blow. When the glorious dust finally settled and the grand time came to hand out the prestigious medals, the incredibly flawed machinery of imperial recognition aggressively protected its own. The brave officers who actually received the shiny decorations and rapid promotions in the comfortable aftermath of the operation were frequently not the men who had bled in the trenches. The system heavily favored the ambitious staff officers who had observed the brutal carnage from a safe, comfortable distance, entirely ignoring the ragged men who had actually manufactured the historic victory. The men who carried the unimaginably heavy weight of the most lethal assignment rarely appeared prominently in the glowing official dispatches that rapidly circulated through the wealthy London headquarters. But the incredibly tough diggers of the 9th Division were not completely surprised by the sickening betrayal, for they had arrived in Egypt fully expecting to be used hard and thanked poorly. They absolutely did not need a shiny piece of metal pinned to their chest by a polished aristocrat to truly understand the magnificent scale of what they had just accomplished. They possessed the quiet, terrifying knowledge that when the proud British generals had a filthy job that would easily break ordinary soldiers, they always frantically sent for the Australians. They had done what desperately needed doing, not for the hollow approval of the very men who had mocked them, but for the sacred bond of brotherhood they shared in the dark.